You guys can see this one? Try this one.
Yeah.
Okay. This way I'm not going back and forth.
Okay.
I do also have the sheet of questions just for your own reference.
Okay.
To warm up.
Yeah.
All righty. You get a chance to get some coffee, maybe? I know, I froze. Good evening, welcome to, Vigil Part 2. We tried this year to bring a little bit of a discussion element into our presentation. But before we go into that, Byzantine Student Union would like to make a special thank you to the president of Catholic University, Mr. John Garvey, for his years of, pardon me a moment. Might be a little bit annoying. For his many years of service to Catholic University, and specifically for the friendship that Byzantine Student Union has had with the school, and for giving us this home to be able to express not only our faith, but our cultural identities. And so I would like to now invite President Garvey to come up and say a few words by way of introduction. Thank you.
Very much. Thanks for having me tonight. In 2019, the Reverend Philip Mount Stephen, who's the Bishop of Truro, conducted an independent review of the persecution of Christians for the UK Foreign Secretary. And it estimated that 1 in 3 people suffers from religious persecutions, and the Christians number highest among them. In some countries in the Middle East, the percentage of suffering Christians is much higher. In some places, treatment approaches the definition of genocide as adopted by the United Nations. Because of this, in places like Iraq, Christians are nearly extinct. Things aren't much better in Palestine, where Christians now represent less than 1.5% of the population. In Egypt, Copts have come under sustained attack by jihadists. And the Aid to the Church in Needs 2021 Religious Freedom in the World report showed that Christian persecution is on the rise. In spite of this, Pope Francis's message on his visit to Iraq in 2021 was one of hope. He reminded Iraqi Christians of the words of Jesus, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The words speak of the death and resurrection of Jesus, but also of the church. The Holy Father went on to say, "The Lord promises that by the power of the resurrection, he can raise us and our communities from ruins left by injustice, division, and hatred." That's the promise we celebrate in the Eucharist, he said. With the eyes of faith, we recognize the presence of the crucified and risen Lord in our midst, and we look to embrace his liberating wisdom, to rest in his wounds, and to find healing and strength to serve the coming of his kingdom in our world. So we gather in that same spirit of hope this evening to pray in Jesus' name for our Christian brothers and sisters in the Middle East. We pray for an end to their persecution, for a triumph of justice, and for peace. Above all, we ask our Lord to give them hope. And as we join them in prayer, let's also remember our brothers and sisters in Ukraine as they defend their homeland. Before I have to leave this evening, take the opportunity to introduce Ambassador Patrick Theros and Professor Wilhelmus Valkenberg. Ambassador Theros served as U.S. Ambassador to Qatar from 1995 to 1998. His foreign service also included service as Deputy Coordinator for Counterterrorism, as Political Advisor to the Commander-in-Chief of Central Command, and Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassies in the United Arab Emirates and in Jordan. More recently, Ambassador Theros served as President of the U.S. Qatar Business Council, so we're honored to have him as part of our panel this evening. And Professor Pim Falkenberg is Ordinary Professor of Religion and Culture in the School of Theology and Religious Studies, and an expert on Christian-Muslim relations and religion and culture, interreligious dialogue, and also medieval theology. So thank you for giving me an opportunity to say a few words and join you this evening. So please join me in welcoming our panelists.
All righty, so thank you very much, President Garvey, and we're honored by your continued friendship to be with you, and you're always more than welcome to join us for a variety of programming. We are the Byzantine Student Union, a student-led organization at the Catholic University of America with a mission to spread our love and knowledge of the Byzantine world, not only the historical aspects, but the modern-day experiences of those living in that region in the world. As a special note, the Byzantine Student Union is a cultural and religious group. It does not take any political perspectives or sides. While we encourage respectful discussion of the current political circumstances found around the world, we do not allow or tolerate offensive or disrespectful comments or actions. This year, we are proud to partner with the United Nations World Interfaith Harmony Week, based on the pioneering work of the Common Word Initiative. And I'm sure that will come up at some point in today's discussion. This initiative, which started in 2007, called for Muslim and Christian leaders to engage in a dialogue based on two common fundamental religious commandments, love of God and love of neighbor, without compromising any of their own religious tenets. The World Interfaith Harmony Week extends the two commandments by adding love of the good and love of the neighbor. This formula includes all people of goodwill. It includes those of other faiths and those with no faiths at all. It is hoped that this initiative will provide a focal point from which all people of goodwill can recognize the common values they hold, far outweigh the differences they have, and thus provide a strong dosage of peace and harmony to their communities. Our presentation tonight features, as you heard, Ambassador Patrick Theros and Dr. Valkenberg. Since we already heard a little bit of an intro, and I'm going to want to invite you to say a couple words, I'm going to skip through the introductory comments. And Dr. Valkenberg, if you want to come on up and say a couple words of your connection to this topic.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Anthony. Maybe I should start when I heard you singing during the vigil. I was reminded of something that I did not include in my comments because it was so long ago. When I was studying theology in the Netherlands, where I come from, this must have been 1973, 1974. We, with a group of students, wanted to go to Greece, and more specifically to Mount Athos. And in order, because we were poor students, in order to gather money for that, we formed a group, I think 11 boys doing theology, most of them Roman Catholic, some of them Old Catholic. And we sang the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom to gather money for that trip. So, of course, the Divine Liturgy and the way of singing in the Byzantine Rite reminded me of that. So when I worked in the Netherlands, I had a couple of ecumenical contacts in the Dutch Council of Churches. The most important of them was that we paid a visit to Jordan, to the Lebanon, Israel, and the Palestine territories, in order to discuss with the Middle East Council of Churches a number of issues on Christian-Jewish and Christian-Muslim relations. And I brought this is the International Review of Mission, a specific number on Christian presence and witness in the Middle East, and I wrote a contribution, kind of a report on that visit. And I remember very vividly the discussions that we had, because people in the Middle East thought of people in the Netherlands, like they probably also thought of people in Germany, that they had this special relationship with Jewish people, but that they tended to forget their own brothers and sisters in faith in the Middle East, the Christian Middle East. So that memory has always stayed with me when I pursued further studies in the relationship between the Abrahamic religions. I have always tried to stay true to the experience that I had in that short stay in these three countries, namely that maybe Christians in the Middle East are not so keen on our way of doing interreligious dialogue because they think it's kind of a luxury that we have here in the West, and that they have a much longer history of being together with Jews and with Muslims that we can learn a lot from. And of course, I always like to add, please give us the opportunity to use the privileged position that we have to explore some of the avenues to get into, let's say, better theological relationship with Jews and Muslims. Okay, so that's kind of my background. I promised Anthony that I wouldn't talk too long. So that is a bit my point of departure. Of course, I have been working most in Christian-Muslim relationships, even though there are a couple of Christian-Jewish relationships. Let me just mention very shortly two. One of them is from my Dutch background, I have long friendships with Turkish Muslims, and I wrote also a book on a Turkish spiritual religious leader, Fethullah Gulen, who is now considered a terrorist by Erdogan, the president now in Turkey. We will talk about it when we talk about Hagia Sophia, I guess. The other experience I had quite recently was when I was sent together with a group of Jewish rabbis and Christian pastors in the Maryland Clergy Initiative to Israel and the Palestine territories. And the main topic there was the topic of the land, which is obviously in Christian-Jewish relations a very important topic, but for Christians always they feel uncomfortable with that topic. And they asked me to go with them because I'm kind of bringing in a element of discussion with Muslims at a time that they would not be able yet to have Muslim discussion partners. That was the Institute for Christian and Jewish Studies in Baltimore. In the meantime, now it's called the Institute for Islamic Christian and Jewish Studies. So they now have their own Muslim counterparts. You mentioned the common word, we will come back to that, but let me leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Valkenberg. Pastor Theros, you want to say a few words by way of introduction? That would be great.
Anthony, Dr. Valkenberg, Byzantine Student Society, thank you very much. Congratulations on setting up this event on what is a perennially important subject, freedom to worship as one wishes or even to not worship at all. I'd like to set a stage for this discussion. As an Eastern Christian, I have to constantly remind audiences here in the United States and Europe that Americans and Europeans have a myopic view of Christianity as a Western religion. This view is not only inaccurate in that it distorts the view that in the West we have of Christianity in the East, but it is also very much part of the problem that part of the causes of the problem of Christianity in the East. Christianity arose in what we now refer to as the Near and Middle East. A little bit of history. For the first 1,500 years of the Christian era, the number of Christians east of the Adriatic greatly outnumbered the Christian population of Western Europe. It's no accident that the early church recognized 4 major ecclesiastical jurisdictions east of the Adriatic and only one, Rome, to the west. At the time of the Council of Nicaea, 4/5 of Christians lived in the Near and Middle East, greatly outnumbering the churches of the West. Precise data is lacking, but Egypt apparently had a Christian majority throughout the first 1,000 years after Christ. It's true, the Muslim conquest of the 7th and 8th centuries reduced those numbers in large part because early Nestorian and Arian Christians suffered persecution from many Christians, namely from the Orthodox rulers of the Roman Empire, and found Muslim beliefs compatible with their own. Conversion for them to Islam was not unreasonable, nor was it in most cases forced. Mind you, the early interaction between Christians and Muslims, though not halcyon, was not the bloodbath that has been portrayed in the West. The difference in the early centuries of the Islamic conquest of the Middle East, the differences between Christianity and Islam were not the visible differences that we see now. A great patriarch of Jerusalem, Theodoros, who passed away in the year 2000, and a good family friend, we come from the same island in Greece, once told me that what we now call the Abrahamic faiths are in fact parts of a single tree. The Jews are the roots of that tree. The church that adhered to the Nicene-Constantinopolitan Creed are the trunk, and Islam was one of the many branches of that tree. The history provides many examples of what can only be described as coexistence. In 632, the Caliph Omar ibn al-Khattab took the surrender of the city of Jerusalem from Bishop Sophronios. Sophronios took Omar on a tour of the city. While at the tomb of Christ, an aide to Omar reminded him that it was prayer time. The bishop offered to let him pray at the tomb in the Church of the Resurrection. Omar said, "No, I'm not going to do that. If I do that, some idiot on my staff is going to make this church into a mosque." And he left the church and walked across the square and prayed there. And this is where the Mosque of Omar in Jerusalem is located today. Later, Omar negotiated an agreement with the bishop. Jerusalem had not yet become a patriarchate, with the bishop, that defined the authority, the privileges, and the responsibilities of the church in the Muslim world. An agreement that is now known as the Treaty of Omar, or the Ahad Omari. An agreement that is still observed and has been observed almost continuously since that day. Every patriarch of Jerusalem, upon assuming the throne of the patriarchate, receives once again a copy of the same letter issued by the local Muslim authority. When the current patriarch of Jerusalem took over in 2005, he received 3 letters, one from the Palestinian Authority, one from the King of Jordan, and one from the state of Qatar, which were the 3 places that where he had churches legally. Why am I going into this history? What has happened since then was a change in the attitude. Christianity has now dwindled to a very small minority throughout the region. Partly, it's because Muslims took vengeance on Eastern Christians for what they saw as the hostility, the colonialism, the depredations of the West. Partly because later Muslim rulers, especially the Ottoman emperors, the Ottoman sultans, in effect copied Western practice. They embraced the idea that a nation state has to be homogeneous in faith as well as in language and political. Today, Christians are down to single digits everywhere in the Eastern Arab world, except for Lebanon and Egypt, and even there, their numbers are declining. ISIS and other jihadists have ignored the teachings of Islam and the early caliphs and have determined to eliminate all Muslims, especially Christians, by whatever brutal means possible. The numbers are, of course, vastly different, but the motivations of extremists and actions bear a chilling resemblance to the Holocaust, as they seek to create what is in effect a Christian-free Islamic nation. Unfortunately, we've seen this phenomenon of established religions homogeneously adopted by politicians and even secular states in the region. Turkey engaged in a century-long purge of Christians and other non-Sunni Muslims that culminated in the population exchanges of 1922, followed by the pogrom of Greeks and Armenians in 1955. Very sadly today, certain elements of the Israeli state have also embraced this policy of religious homogeneity with various groups, some of them supported from the U.S. and the West, determined to eliminate the native Christian presence in Jerusalem itself. I must admit to a certain pessimism as to the survival of Christianity in its birthplace. Some Western Christians are ambivalent as to whether the indigenous Eastern Christians really deserve their support. Others see it as an act of charity, but more often show that charity by helping Christians immigrate from their ancestral homes. Political pressure or even the occasional invasion doesn't help. Our invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the subsequent civil war, essentially by what were perceived as Western Christian countries, has only contributed to the exodus. I think the end of Christianity in Iraq is almost with us and is a direct result of the invasion of Iraq. The survival of the ancient Christian churches of the East depends on a paradigm change in the relationship between Islam and Christianity, a return perhaps to the relationship between Omar and Sophronius. I confess I do not have a formula for doing so. I'd be happy to continue this discussion afterwards.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Make sure you might need to turn on the little mic.
Is it not on?
Because try tapping it, and if we can hear, then it's on. Yours is on. Perfect. Yeah, so, I think one of the things that you pointed out really struck me is that there is a certain difference in attitude that, Western Christians or even the West as a whole views Christianity in the Middle East and in other, even the Far East. Turkey, right, was sort of that moment that suddenly the situation broke headlines, all around the world. Specifically, if you don't know, it was in 2021, I want to say, towards the end of the year, was when the president of Turkey legally changed the status of the Hagia Sophia Church back into mosque, right? It had changed back apparently since 1935. It had been a museum and was then converted back to a mosque, almost as a sort of, hearkening back to how many years under Ottoman rule when the church was an active mosque. Dr. Valkenberg, what are some theological considerations in this sort of dichotomy of going from, an Orthodox, the pinnacle of Byzantine Christianity, to mosque, to museum, then back to a mosque?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, there's an interesting observation that you come across many places in the Middle East in the large sense of the word. For instance, if I include Al-Andalus, the southern part of Spain, that also was for a long part under Muslim rule, you see the same phenomenon there. that there were churches that were converted into mosques and then later on again converted into churches. So apparently the same places have been sacred to different religions. So that's a more general observation. I would say, of course, because it's Constantinople, then Istanbul, it is a very significant place. It was also a place, the center of power, of course, first in the Byzantine Empire, then under the Ottomans. Then you had Atatürk, who established the secular Republic of Turkey and made the mosque a museum in order to show his form of secularism. So you can say, and now I'm answering your question about a couple of theological reflections. So you can say the advantage of a museum was that everyone could come there. Everyone could see, let's say, the Christian mosaics, also the Muslim shields with the names of Allah and Muhammad. And I do remember I was with a Muslim friend and we walked there together and I showed him the Christian symbolism in the place and he showed me the Muslim symbolism. Now, I must say, when Erdogan decided to bring it back to a mosque, and of course there were all kinds of reactions, I had a very ambiguous feeling. On the one hand, of course, you can say for Christians that is bringing farther away. On the other hand, you can say it's bringing it closer. Let me try to explain. So if the goal of a church is to be a place where God is worshipped, you can say that the mosque is a place where God is still worshipped, even though it's not worshipped in the way in which Christians would like it to be. But, and here we get on to some finer points of, let's say, what the Catholic Church has established in the Second Vatican Council by saying that Christians and Muslims together worship the one God. On the other hand, as I said before, it not being a mosque but a museum gave the opportunity for relationships, people walking through it together. It's more open. All in all, I would say if a place becomes again a place where God is worshipped, we are closer to the original intentions of the builders of the Hagia Sophia.
You know, that's an interesting perspective almost because, I mean, you know, just thinking you go down to the Smithsonian, right, there's a certain lack of reverence that will be observed for, you know, sacred items of the American experience. And so, yeah, you know, you raise a good point. I don't think very many Christians, even outside of that region, you know, some of them see it as this sort of affront, right? Especially viewing some of the reactions of celebration, etc., that was taking place in the Hagia Sophia and in the streets around there. Ambassador, how do we reconcile this sort of these state actions, right? The state decrees X, Y, and Z will now occur with this property, to the actions of the citizens, right? Their perspectives, to sort of these preconceived stereotypes that we have of that Christians have of Muslims, that Muslims have of Christians.
I think we have a special case in the politics behind the reconversion of Hagia Sophia from a museum back into a church. This was Erdogan establishing his street cred, so to speak. He's finished with Ataturk. It is no longer Ataturk. The secular state is gone. And this was a symbolic way of establishing it. Ataturk had established he's got a larger picture. It wasn't just that Hagia Sophia was a museum. In the years after the Treaty of Lausanne, 1922, the Greek government, the Turkish government, the Turkish Republic, established a modus vivendi where almost all the mosques in Greece became museums, and the ancient churches, most of the ancient churches in Turkey became museums. And this was an understanding that the two states had reached a certain modus vivendi.
Interesting.
So the decision, so for Erdogan, I'm reestablishing the old order. I'm ridding Turkey of the disease that Ataturk brought to it. I'm ridding Turkey of secularism, and not only that, but I am establishing Turkey as what it is, or what it should be, the dominant power in the region. So Erdogan may or may not be a man of faith. I personally think that most dictators aren't, but they are very good at this. They're very good at using faith.
Yes.
Exploiting faith. I think this was a political move. It appealed. The people in the street rioting or celebrating or whatever it was were people who basically have embraced Erdogan's vision of Turkey as he would like it to be. Davutoglu, the former foreign minister, wrote a really well-written book on essentially what is Turkey reestablishing the role of the Ottoman Empire, even if it's not going to call itself the Ottoman. So you have to see this in political terms. How do you deal with this? I agree completely with Dr. Valkenberg that there is no reason why both faiths cannot pray in the same building. And for both, it is a sacred space. There are some, how can I say, there are some instances where this already occurs. For example, if you go to the monastery of St. Catherine's in Sinai, there is a mosque in the middle of it. It is a mosque that is built to accommodate the Bedouin who have long regarded it as their duty to protect the monastery. There's nothing theologically, as far as I can tell, and I'm not I would defer to the better theologians, but to me, the church is where you have a liturgy where the priest brings the antimintium and puts it on whatever table he finds, and that is where the church is.
Basic requirement for.
Yeah, but that is in essence, it is the basic requirement, and you can do it anywhere you want. There is nothing to prevent you from doing it anyway. So, I once suggested that perhaps the best way to deal with this would be for the Greek government to offer the Turkish government saying, we'll take all the mosques that we've converted into museums and we will allow Muslims to pray there if the Muslims will take all the churches the church will take all the churches and allow Orthodox Christians or Armenians or anyone else to pray there inside Turkey. The idea didn't get
a certain
very far.
equality to this.
Yeah, the idea didn't get very far, but it was
It was a fair attempt.
yeah, the fair attempt, yeah.
Well, and I think a lot of this, right? So many world leaders, focus on finding these solutions, but a lot of this really comes down to the individuals in these countries, right? The citizens, their interactions with each other, as we mentioned earlier, right? They have their own fraught history with each other, and we're sort of looking through the window at their interactions. So, I mean, Dr. Valkenberg, what would you say is sort of the average experience of a Christian, let's say in Turkey, right, from a day-to-day life? How would it compare? And I'm not saying about, necessarily, obviously there's cultural differences, there's some of those differences. What would make the Christian experience distinct from, say, the Muslim experience?
Well, first of all, Christians are an absolute minority in Turkey. As I think we mentioned before, most of them were deported in this exchange of people with Greece. There are some places, of course, where there's a visible Christian presence of the past. Cappadocia, of course, Ephesus. There are places where you can see there is some unity. For instance, the House of Mary near Ephesus is a place of prayer for both Christians and Muslims. So you can say, and there's literature on this, that often Mary seems to be the figure that unites at a more popular level piety by Catholics, Eastern Christians, and Muslims. I would say for the rest, I have not met many Christians in Turkey because there aren't many. Of course, there is the Patriarchate in Istanbul, and there's a number of pockets of Christians, but it's a very isolated history.
Yeah, no, for sure. You know, there's almost like this zeitgeist that takes place when we think of Christian persecution, that it's always Christians good, Muslims bad. And that this entire region, this entire subject has almost been painted by this. At least I experienced this just in growing up, being raised up in a Greek household where, you hear about these things at the parish. There was a bombing at a church in Syria on Easter Sunday. Oh, the Muslims must have done, terrible situation, etc. But we know that things are a lot more complex than that, right? And so just to turn attention to perhaps one of the most cohesive cities in the Middle East, Jerusalem, right, where you have all three Abrahamic faiths calling, in the case of the Temple Mount, literally a sacred space, but also in their own distinct sacred environments, their own distinct neighborhoods, as it were, where there's a lot more other factors taking place. Ambassador Theros, I know as we were talking, preparing for this event, you mentioned specifically one situation. Did you want to expound into that a little bit further?
Yes. Earlier, as I said, there is a movement within the Israeli body politic, centered mostly on the settler movement and certain aspects of the settler movement that are trying to create what they an Israel that is a copy of a homogeneous European state, a state in which minorities are either non-existent or invisible, a state in which 90% of the population follows the same faith, in which 90% of the population identifies on a common culture, a common religion, a common language. And they see the Christian presence, particularly the indigenous Christian presence in Jerusalem, as a threat to that dream. It has to be removed, particularly from Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is so visible. And again, I don't say that this is the policy of the state, but the state is in fact guilty of sometimes not enforcing its own laws because of the domestic political considerations of the state. There is one particular organization called Ateret Kohanim. It is actually an American 501c3 charity. And its objective, and if you read their literature, is to reclaim the city of Jerusalem. The definition of reclaim the city of Jerusalem is to remove the non-Jewish presence from the old city in particular.
Interesting.
And they've done this through a variety of means, but their current target is the properties of the churches. All the how can I say, the ancient churches, the churches that have been there for a long time, the 13 churches that have been there for hundreds of years or thousands of years, depending on which one, survive on the revenues from their real estate. Having talked to Jerusalem, having talked to the bursar, so to speak, patriarchate, they don't make money from pilgrims. Pilgrims cost them a great deal more to support and put up with than what they get from the pilgrims. All the churches, every church, 400 religious sites for the Orthodox Church alone. The schools between all the Christian churches, schools with 20, 30,000 students in them. Students of all faiths, I might add, several hospitals and so forth. All of those receive the bulk of their support from the revenues of their real estate. And the aim of Ateret Kohanim is to find ways, either legal or illegal or semi-legal, to take the real estate away from the churches. If you take the real estate away, the churches can no longer support themselves. They can no longer provide services to the indigenous population, and they hope through this way to basically turn the Christian parts of Holy City into empty museums.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and we've seen this in Turkey as well, right? Where the
Turks have gone one
patriarchate
step further. They don't even do the museum part.
Yeah, interesting. Byzantine Student Union, obviously our focus has always been in that region of the world. But I mean, I think we're at the point where it's impossible to ignore just the violence, the death and destruction that we've been seeing across the last few days in Ukraine. And even beyond Ukraine, it's sometimes easy to forget that Christians are persecuted, and not just Orthodox Christians, but the institution of Christianity is persecuted around the world, from Africa to Asia to India. Part of Jesus says, right, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And we have what's the unique situation in Ukraine right now is we have Christians fighting against Christians. I think one of the headlines just this morning I was seeing was Russian soldiers were confused of who to shoot at because they look like their neighbors, like their brothers. And so, obviously there's a variety of political factors at play here. But starting with you, Dr. Valkenberg, what would you say are some of those considerations that are playing into this whole dynamic, this whole situation?
Yeah, I would probably need to start by saying I need to be a little careful because I'm talking about a culture that I don't know close. But I think one of the elements that you can see happening, and that I've heard about also in my conversations here in the School of Theology and Religious Studies, is of course there are different forms of Byzantine, Russian Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox into different varieties, then Ukrainian Greek Catholic, and they all have the same background, or at least in large part the same background, and that of course on the one hand I would say shows that they are so similar, what you just pointed at. On the other hand, there are religious differences related to, let's say, Russian Orthodox or Byzantine Orthodox backgrounds, and then, of course, Catholic, Ukrainian Catholic backgrounds. So I would say one of the strengths, but also one of the problems of Christianity in that part of Europe is the idea of the
Autocephalous.
Yes, I was thinking I can probably pronounce this better in Greek than in English. So the autocephalous institutions, of course, which you saw with the very close link between nationality, ethnicity, and then religion. Sometimes I think it's a strength, but sometimes it is a problem, and that's a problem that we now see in Ukraine.
Yeah. I will pause for a moment here, just a moment, to help our tech team out. Now we'll return in a second.
Batteries, yeah.
Someone for electric cars too.
Yeah.